Anyway, it's good to be with you, and we're going to talk about a project to help enhance STEM education of minority, especially tribal students, graduate education. And Elizabeth, a little bit later, we'll talk more about the specifics of that program. And I'm going to start by giving some tribal college background and some of my experiences that have helped motivate us in this project. So I grew up on the Leech Lake Reservation, and a big part of it was being outside and doing all those things, hunting, fishing, and especially harvesting rice every year. I worked, after I did some undergrad work, I worked in a laboratory for a while, doing environmental work, analytical chemistry. And then for 11 and a half years, I taught at the Leech Lake Tribal College, primarily biology and chemistry courses. And in the last couple of years, I've been working on a PhD at the University of Minnesota in the Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology department. So to start with, I'm going to share a little bit of the research I've been doing, and I think it's illustrative of the kind of things we're interested in. STEM students doing work on native lands, and what does that look like, and what kind of things are involved, and what are the challenges and obstacles. So there's this invasive macroalgae, starry stonewort, that's made its way through the Great Lakes and is moving into inland lakes throughout the Midwest and Minnesota. And when we first heard of this this new invasive species, we're always concerned, like, what would this do if it got into our lakes? It has a similar habitat and found in a similar ecosystem to our wild rice. So we always wondered what would happen. It can form these big pillows and choke out all kinds of all the other native plant species. So that was a concern of ours, and it's spreading throughout the Midwest. And for Ojibwe people, wild rice is really critically important. I mean, it's part of all of the history, language, ceremonies, and everybody that's Ojibwe in Minnesota knows about rice, and it's important to them. So there was a real need to think about this threat and what it could mean. And we do have some areas where starry stonewort is growing right in proximity to some native wild rice stands. So here's a map of the Leech Lake Reservation, and it's really an incredible area. I think something like 72% of the surface area of the reservation is surface water, lakes and streams, or wetlands, and the rest is trees. So lakes and forests and all the resources that go with them. And we have now 2 locations. You know, there are 40 beds, wild rice beds, that the Leech Lake Band manages on the reservation. So harvesting and the economies around wild rice are really gigantic for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. And we have 2 locations, one up in the northern part of Lake Winnie and one on the western part of Leech Lake, where we have starry stonewort now growing in proximity to our wild rice. And you know, some of in this case, my study site, this invasive species was introduced in a private harbor, and it's since spread out and into a really great rice bed. You know, I personally harvested rice several days in this area, and there are a lot of people out there. It's a huge rice bed. And here's just a portion of it. So some of the work we've been doing is we're trying to track how this invasive species is spreading. So we got some long-term plots, and this involves a lot of diving and doing aquatic plant surveys in select areas, and this kind of underwater work is really challenging, and it makes for long and difficult days. Another thing I'm doing is on a smaller scale, right at the interface where the starry stonewort is meeting the wild rice. I've got a series of grids, and I'm charting the changes, the growth of the starry and the wild rice throughout the growing season. and documenting all the other, the changes in all the other plant species, and doing some sediment work and sediment analysis as well. Here's some other pictures of me setting some of this stuff up. And we've done some other kinds of, we're also doing some other kinds of surveys with the wild rice to determine effectiveness of some removal techniques for starry stonewort, some of those kind of things. And I'm also doing some growth experiments with wild rice to try to tease out what the nutrition competition looks like between starry stonewort and wild rice. So, and really throughout this process, from the very beginning, it was always done in a way and with total cooperation, inclusion of the band. We've always approached this as we're going to respect the local community and respect the rice, the monoman. And that was really the guiding principle to this whole thing. And so we're using a lot of Western science, but everything is laying on this important piece here. We're doing things, and we've got a committee of elders that oversees our work, and they're really interested. They're interested in our work, but they're also challenging us to operate in a way that's always respectful. So I think about, this is really a blend of Western science and the traditional Ojibwe perspective. And so now I'm going to circle around a little bit. I taught for 11 years at the Leech Lake Tribal College, and there are now 37 tribal colleges in the United States. And it was really, it's really based on this idea of sovereignty, that the Native nations of the United States have this ability to govern themselves and make decisions about their future. And it came from, so there's a history of the U.S. federal Indian policy that was, it's been a real a difficult history for Native people, from removal, allotment, termination. And in the late 60s, early 70s, the U.S. government kind of changed its position to a position of self-determination, where they wanted to create the conditions for a new era in which the Indian future is determined by Indian acts and Indian decisions. And from this, tribal nations wanted to begin to think about, how do we educate our own people? And so built on this history of boarding schools and a reaction to the boarding school era in the U.S., where Native kids were taken out of Native communities and educated at these white institutions, weren't allowed to speak their language. So it was a thing that was foreign to the people, and the tribal college movement was a reaction to this. They wanted to be in control of the education, and they wanted to educate their own Native students in their communities in a way that respected their history and their tradition. So I taught at Leech Lake Tribal College. Here's some pictures, and it was really, my heart's still in the place. I loved every minute of it. It was a great experience, and a lot of all these tribal colleges, they're trying to provide education that's kind of grounded in cultural values. And I think here's I don't remember exactly where I got this paragraph. I think I pulled it off a state of Washington Indian education report. Anyway, what I liked, I read this and I thought, wow, that's cool. And there's some things that popped out at me. Indian education, they're looking at all children as gifted and talented, and they talk about community and cultivating these skills, and it's a shared experience. And I think this is very different than mainstream education a lot of times. So our tribal college students are predominantly Native American, predominantly first generation students. Their parents haven't had any secondary education. Average age of our students is a little bit older than typical mainstream students. A lot of our students are already parents, and I always recognize this difference in academic competition. I think a lot of mainstream education is built around competition, and sometimes hyper competition is, their students are more, they want to see everybody succeed. They don't want to succeed at the expense of their classmates. And it's a very different feel. So the tribal colleges have, Leech Lake Tribal College have several STEM degrees, 2-year associate degrees, and teach a variety of courses that you might, familiar, that same kind of things you might teach in mainstream schools, biology, chemistry, those things, math. And there's also some other kinds of more cultural and traditional courses, like our ethnobiology course. Anyway, I give this as a background, tribal colleges. And so I'm going to share a little bit of ed data that I've been poring over and recently, and I think it's really, the first time I really started looking at this kind of data, it kind of alarmed me. The whole time I was working at the tribal college, I always thought it was my job or my responsibility to try to take as many of those students as I could and move them into 4-year STEM programs at the neighboring state school or anywhere else they wanted to go. And had limited success with that, but that's what I always thought that I should be doing. So looking at this education data, I realized that it was, it's a much more difficult thing to do that than maybe I was appreciating at the time. So according to the 2020 U.S. Census, and there's some debate on the accuracy of the census in regards to Indigenous people in the U.S. But maybe, there were some changes, the way the questioning was done with the census. So some people think that the numbers that the U.S. Census shows us actually might be a little higher than our actual numbers of Native people in the U.S. But maybe Native people represent about 2.5% of the population. So keep that in mind. And so this is some graphs, and this is a couple years old, but looking at master's and doctoral degree attainment by race for STEM and engineering degrees in the United States. So master's degrees, you can see white students, Asian, Black, and Hispanic. And this little yellow silver on the end is our Native American students, American Indian and Alaska Native students. And it's just a sliver, it's a tiny percent, right? It's much smaller than that 2.5% that Native people represent in the population. And same with the doctoral program. So they represent just a tiny sliver. And this is even maybe more interesting. I don't know what to think of this. So from 2017 to 2021, the actual numbers, and these are just minority students, science and engineering degrees. So the number of minority students has gone up, but the actual share of American Indian students has gone down in that time. So even just looking just at the minority students, the numbers are don't look good for American Indian students in degree attainment. So I looked at this big data set from the National Center for Education Statistics, and I'm going to zoom in on a couple pieces. So these are STEM bachelor degrees from 2011 to 2020. And, we see pretty much increases across the board in just about everything. Total degrees awarded goes up considerably. Degrees from white students increases, Black students it increases, Hispanics it increases, everything increases. Native American students are actually going down. So in that 10-year period, 2011 to 2020, the share of American Indian students, more degrees are awarded, but the share of American Indian students is actually going down. It's decreasing. And all these other groups by race are increasing. I'm gonna give me 1 second. I'm sorry, I have to interrupt myself. I apologize for that interruption. I had a low battery warning on my computer. I had to plug it in quick before I. So same thing with STEM master's degrees. Again, increases across the board except the American Indian students. Gone down in that period of time. And, the largest increases and the largest percent are foreign students. So in this data set for these master's degrees, the share of white plus foreign students, represents about 80% of the degrees awarded. The bulk of degrees awarded have gone to foreign students and white students. And one more slide here. These are STEM doctoral degrees. And again, the American Indian share has gone down considerably, and we see, really 34, these are small numbers, compared to some of these other groups. And all the other groups have seen increases as the total number of degrees awarded has increased, but the American Indian percent has actually decreased. So this was like, I'm looking at this data, thinking about this, and there must be some real obstacles, right, to getting American Indian students through these programs. I'm gonna, and I just, the tribal colleges really represent a unique opportunity. There were, in my experience, there were a lot of students that wouldn't have even gone to college. They wouldn't have tried a state school. They wouldn't have tried any other kind of school. But having those tribal colleges, they gave it a shot. And so we were getting some students that wouldn't have tried it anywhere else, or might not have even been accepted anywhere else. So you have a unique opportunity to get these students. But the challenge is, so we take these students, how do we move them forward into 4-year STEM programs and beyond, into graduate programs? That's the challenge, and that's part of what we're trying to look at with our program. And I want to make a couple more comments, I guess. When I think about what kind of education do our students really need? Are we, we see that having a cultural education, an education that's grounded in Anishinaabe values, really can engage our students and create some very enthusiastic students. We got to balance that with, what do they really need? What kind of skills do they need to be able to compete and to survive in 4-year STEM programs? And I've seen sort of a rise in recent years of these sustainability degrees at different schools, and I've kind of I'm not against, certainly not against the things that are being taught here, but I think there's been an unintended consequence of this, and I think I've seen our local state school had one of these degrees, and so we had students that we were tracking toward STEM degrees, and instead they got into the sustainability program, and I just thought they were missing an opportunity to really position themselves to make a difference. When I started working at the lab years ago, we did work for regional work for tribes in the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and we'd go out to these tribes and do some work, collect samples sometimes, and every tribe we were at, the head person of the Department of Natural Resource or whatever they had was a Native person, and oftentimes a bunch of seasonal and tech level people were Native people that they'd brought in. But all these positions that required 4-year degrees, whether it was the fisheries biologist, the forester, plant ecologist, wildlife biologist, all of these positions were held by non-Native people from somewhere else, and it was almost exclusive across the board. And I just thought those are the positions we've got to get Native people ready for. And I've always tried to do that. And there's been some improvement in that area, but still a lot of those positions are continuing to be held by people from somewhere else that aren't part of these communities. So I think there's a real need to do that. And having those people, Native people in these positions, they'll be positioned to really address the real challenges that lay ahead, whether it's climate change, different kind of land use issues, because they're from these areas. They're going to be more passionate, more engaged in protecting these areas. So that's always been a thing for me. I wanted to see these people, as many Native students as we could, move into those kinds of positions. And I think it requires kind of a blend of Western science and having that traditional perspective. And so that's the challenge. So that I'll turn it over to Elizabeth, and she can give us some specifics on the program project we're working on.
Thank you. Can you put it on slide 1 for me, please, Steve?
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. It's so nice to see everyone. Thank you for lending your afternoon, morning, or evening to us. So I'm going to try to bring a few of the points that Steve has made together with some of the ideas and ways that I've been thinking about this work. I am Huanca and Quechua from Central Peru, and I'm not a Tribal Nation member from Minnesota, but live and work here in Minnesota and teach at the University of Minnesota. So I feel I am indebted to the peoples and lands here. So what is my responsibility then as an indigenous person from somewhere else? So Steve and I worked together on a research planning project that focuses on Native faculty at tribal colleges and universities and their pursuits and possibilities with STEM graduate education. And I'll share a little bit more about that work in a few moments. But I start with that because after a meeting that we had this week with one of our project partners, Steve actually said to me quite firmly, we don't need another research study on why there are no Native scientists. And I would add, or why there are the few that exist. And he's right. At least for what we are trying to do, we don't need to research the history of how higher education writ large and over the last 300 years has failed Native students, or why and how STEM fields just can't seem to produce Native scientists. In 2025, there is a good amount of research that asks and answers these questions through analysis of the history of the education of Indians by others in the U.S. context. And over the last decade, using federal research support that is now being erased, there has been increasing information on Native students and STEM. We know quite a bit about cultural clashes and cultural matches in education, all termed in much catchier and smarter ways by other scholars. We also know about blame, the many spaces where Native students should be learning, but, quote, fall through the cracks, and under whose watch. Of course, there are complications and nuances to everything, but the result always seems to be the same, which is that Native communities are still grappling with the tensions and anxieties that systemic violence has wrought. In other words, Native people neither belong nor are truly safe anywhere in the colonial-built environment, or with the recent birthright citizenship arguments by the new U.S. administration, even on their own lands. This dynamic is playing out in real time. White national settler sovereignty is in a face-off with tribal and original peoples' autochthony. Yet we maintain that in this context, Native families still have a right to every level of education that they want, and the advocates of Native students and Native students themselves have a right to demand the removal of barriers to access and success. Banned words now. The figures that Steve presented are appalling, and we should have a problem with the fact that the first peoples who are the first rights holders across these lands have had education systematically weaponized across their communities. Education is both assimilation and civilization through punishment, and 100 years later, it's benevolent opportunity. However, the question of which is it isn't the right question anymore. It is what we make it, and Native people have been making some pretty cool things, but what they make is always threatened. In my view, the statistics that Steve shared and the very long history that those numbers are connected to presents evidence of what I refer to as violence by reduction and diminishment. I build on Jamil Salmi's typology of violence, where violence is direct and indirect, and where indirect violence is violence by omission, which is the refusal to protect, mediated violence, which is violence to the environment such that it makes conditions for human life extremely difficult, repressive violence or deprivation of fundamental rights, and alienating violence or deprivation of higher rights, including through racism. I see violence by reduction and diminishment as experienced by members of society, in this case, Native peoples, who have encountered all of those violences and yet who are denied the possibility of mitigating its harms through their abilities to fully facilitate their own healing and caring for themselves and their lands. Violence by reduction and diminishment is the denial of people's access to the tools that they need in order to become resilient. It is the denial of the skills and many kinds of knowledges that they need in order to envision and craft their own futures. It is the perpetrator's suppression of the dreams of their victims. When Native people are denied the right through every level of education that they want and need in order to heal, care, access tools, skills, and knowledges that address the damage caused by direct and indirect violence, this is a very deceptive kind of denial because higher education, and certainly graduate education, has been masked as privilege. Slide 2, please. If tribal nation members who are from tribal communities make it to higher education and into STEM, they do so for reasons that are very different from those of their non-Native peers and professors. There's a good deal of seminal writing on this based on empirical studies with Native students who articulate why they pursue STEM, for example. If you're interested, please see the writing of Vanessa Anthony Stevens and Philip Stevens, who are doing some incredible work at the University of Idaho with tribal nations and tribal students. Tribal nation students have powerful commitments to family, community, nation, and land. Those tribal nation students who grew up on their tribal lands or who are at least connected to their lands and their families in some way, maybe through hunting or fishing, maybe through ceremonies or language, or maybe through hanging out with grandparents and aunties and friends, by and large embody commitment to protect their tribal lands and all that is there. And I think that it's really important that any advocate of natives in STEM invest time, and I mean years, as well as resources and emotional energy into understanding these commitments. Not to co-opt them for research or to perform them back to the university or to be gross and go Native, but to sympathize with Native students' mental models of what it means to go home, which is often hard and beautiful all at once. And this is because while the earth and her beings are just as they are, so are human communities with all of their complications. Slide 3, please. So I think in order to work with Native students, we need to develop a shared baseline around land. And as educators, we have to accept that Native land is also political. Many people have written about settler colonialism, coloniality, liberalism, extractive capitalism, and national governments. So there are a lot of resources on these interconnected themes. However, it's ironic to me that university representatives here in the United States and at the University of Minnesota, where I work, will do a land recognition and cite calls for reparative relations with tribes, yet will not work to require of themselves, faculty, including scientists, or students any sort of learning about the active dispossession of Native peoples from their lands, let alone any discussion of divestment from the forces that harm tribal nations today. This is where I think that the contributions of Indigenous resurgence scholars is apt. Those working to transform themselves and universities from a baseline of land have to move with tribal nations and their students away from institutional recognition and state legitimacy of tribal sovereignty, where legitimacy only reifies state authority as the grantor of sovereignty, and they need to work towards resurgence for the sake of land and the life there. Indigenous resurgence scholars and non-Indigenous friends of resurgence never prescribe the composition of resurgence. It is highly collective and communal, but also asks individuals for a lifelong commitment to constant connection and reconnection with place, cultural practices, and all of the structures that make up how a tribal nation functions, including its environmental protections, educational systems, healthcare systems, governance strategies, both adopted and catonic, etc. Many might say that this is asking too much of university faculty and STEM faculty in particular, who signed up to be scientific researchers and teachers, not political activist adrenaline junkies. And for some, it's probably just enough to be really good at being a scientist and a scholar who is a little sympathetic to tribal students at best, or maybe indifferent and sort of an I don't see color educator. But at the University of Minnesota, we have something called the Truth Report, which tribal researchers and university students worked on through a Mellon Foundation grant, and which was not funded by the university independently. And there are really good conversations that have ensued since its release a couple of years ago. And there are really well-intentioned and authentically kind people doing things with it. But when we have this kind of research, just like in Canada, you have the Truth and Reconciliation findings and recommendations, universities and regional stakeholders, in our case, the state and other states and institutions that benefited from Minnesota tribal nation land dispossession and death, we need to ask, what does this information lead us to accomplish? In our case, Steve summarized it really well in a meeting debrief the other day. He asked, how does reconciliation, how does the Truth Report get tribal students in and through STEM programs? This question is somewhat about how organizations learn and change, but it's also about how good people are leveraged. Right now at the University of Minnesota, there are good people working to learn about better ways of serving tribes. But this week, next year, it remains to be seen how their will be impacted through the current threats to research funding, where even pretty straightforward scientific studies are flagged for their association with terms like environmental justice, and where that term is being explicitly and misleadingly linked to so-called leftist ideology that has supposedly poisoned science into wokeness at the very least, or created scientific research that is criminal, radical, and heretical at the worst. In this moment, can the good people preserve and grow nascent relationships with tribal nations and indigenous communities, or will they prioritize other things? And who protects the good people? This is why, without a shared baseline, tribal nations and tribal students will remain a curiosity linked with good intentions that come and go. Slide 4, please. If we can't be dependent on others to save or stand by us, we have to turn and stay inward with tribal nations and indigenous communities and our students. A lot of what it seems like I'm talking about may sound like an appeal to the settler university. Please see us. And the settler state, please don't strip our rights. But there is work that Indigenous scholars and co-architects of decoloniality are doing that decenters both of those through celebrating the agency of Indigenous peoples as ingenious and resourceful. Vanessa Anthony Stevens and Philip Stevens propose academic rating based on Apache rating. Philip is San Carlos Apache. In a forthcoming publication, they write that culturally to Apaches, raiding was an, quote, intelligent and necessary reaction to invasion of Europeans on Apache land. Raiding was the response to the continued insistence of Europeans that their way of living trumped the way of life for Apaches. The freedom to live as an Apache was seen as detrimental to the freedom to live as European, unquote. They argue that raiding allowed Apaches to gather what they call the necessities of life through appropriation of goods to sustain the community, and that this was a covert action undertaken in contested spaces. Applied to academia, and in the case that Steve and I discuss, the university, they write that, quote, academic rating for Indigenous students is the very act of going into the European system, constructed by European and Western thought worlds and housed in the buildings that it has invented. They acknowledge the difficult histories of schools as tricky, weird, haunted places. Yet Indigenous students will raid cautiously without calling attention to themselves. And I think that this is a really important point because Indigenous presence in higher education and in STEM isn't always about being overt and declarative of one's identity and strategies or sharing tribal ways of knowing in exchange for something. In other words, a learning experience that Native peoples are owed. The Stevens say that the objective of academic rating is to get tools, ideas, concepts, the goods of schooling so that they can be refashioned and appropriated to fit within students' home communities and their people's way of doing things, which signals a return to place-based knowledge systems that do not depend solely on the individual, unquote. So tribal students raid from spaces built upon Indigenous places that through colonial settlement are rendered no place, as Philip and Vanessa propose, and always with their home places in mind. Said more clearly, in ours, and I would venture to say in their experiences, tribal students who come from tribal nations and who are still connected to those places use what they procure at significant monetary and non-monetary cost to themselves, their families, and their communities in order to protect and care for their lands and people. Of course, we can't speak for other people working with tribal students elsewhere, but this is Steve's and my experience. Slide 5, please. What we are doing with all of this, the theorizing and understanding of student motivations and our commitment to shared baseline of valuing tribal lands and all that they touch, is looking for ways to change the entire system. And that for us means thinking about individual agents within universities and changing the hearts that can and want to be reached, and changing minds through identifying clear competences that we do not compromise. Change also means rethinking science training through reimagining sites of learning, but not learning content entirely. And I want to say something about modifying learning content for minoritized peoples. And I'm not talking about culturally relevant education, but rather the idea that Native peoples need to have science dumbed down for them, which is what educational scholars will recognize as adaptive education, which historically was education separated according to racial fit and utilized by the whites as part of the rationalization for apartheid in South Africa. Also, our work argues against the idea that Indigenous knowledges are the same as Western science, which we believe is unhelpful to scientists and would-be Native scientists. Maybe 25 years ago, I agreed with other Indigenous education scholars the definitions of science ought to be more capacious. But it's not. And this is why I like Vanessa and Philip's analogy of raiding, because I'm going to selectively and carefully raid what my community needs, not spend my time trying to argue that what I'm raiding is the same as the teachings of my grandmother or my aunts, who were genius farmers and herbalists. nor am I going to spend my good energy trying to force the concrete and steel walls of the university or science industry to look and feel just like my grandma's adobe house and her farm. And I'm going to raid intelligently because there's a lot of important information and resources within the concrete and steel that will help me to protect what I love. However, because universities are built on tribal lands, it is unquestionable that they and the state and legacy wealth holders that established them and that were produced by them have a responsibility to reparative work. Our current work assumes this and brings it together with the 37 tribal colleges in the US that were not built under the same exploitative and wealth extracting premise. And this is a highly historical and political effort that our project draws from because tribal nations are not minorities. Tribal members may be actively minoritized and invisibilized, but they are members of political entities, and tribal colleges are likewise not MSIs or minority serving institutions. So I can say a little bit more about our project, which uses a few frames, and you can see under our transformational aims, there's a few frames that we're using in order to characterize the work that we do and to motivate really an essential question around what does it take to build a critical mass of Native scientists with tribal colleges and universities and at tribal colleges and universities. But I'm going to go ahead and stop there since we only have a few minutes and in case there's any questions. Thank you so much for your time.